Hi, Smita, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS. My first question to you is, it's actually two questions, Smita. So can you explain to the audience what development economics is? And also, you're the first microeconomist that we've had on the show. Would you like to explain what attracted you to study micro rather than macroeconomics?
It's actually a great set of two questions, because I would return the first one and say, the second one and say, why in the world am I your first micro person? But let's just dive into the first question for a second. It's a pleasure to be here. So hello to you and your audiences. Development economics is a mixed, contentious area. And it has, for many, many years, had a big fight about whether or not it studies economies that are so-called developing, or it's a subclass of economics, or it's a different economics, and so on. I would much rather say I study the phenomenon of economic development, which is fairly neutral to the arguments about whether we hive off the economics or treat them differently. And once you do that, you actually end up with a whole set of more interesting research questions to ask about, indeed, can one do that at all? Why micro? I have to say, partly because I came out of the sciences, I was always somebody who was genuinely curious about how things came together. I wanted to understand how technologies work. I wanted to understand how firms made the decisions they made. Why were different kinds of organizations pooled together in some economies but not others? So I really like the kind of hands-on feel of micro, and with the caveat that microeconomics as we know it is fairly imprecise about studying issues of technological change in particular. So I'll get to that in a second, but I think it's just to pitch for new audiences for your show as well. I think this is a tremendously exciting time for anybody interested in micro, partly because we know from our macro models that not only is there a great deal of contention about what the meso or micro level requires, but there's also an opportunity to get into areas like health or climate or energy, all kinds of new crossover complex areas that really lend themselves much better in the study of micro.
And do you think that innovation is the one thing that drives a modern economy?
That's a question I would like to rephrase, which is, I don't think it's the only driver of the modern economy. After all, we need many ways in which you need to provide goods and services which might not be especially innovative, but might be responsive. So not everything has to be new in the sense of innovation. You can have mature products or mature services that could be done in a new way. So I would perhaps parse that in a little bit more detail. I would say that we do know, whether it's Schumpeterian or other kinds of frameworks, we do know that innovation can be addressed along multiple types of novelty. And only one of those types requires what we tend to think of in the business literatures as, exciting new products or processes. In fact, you could have new markets, you could have new types of organizations, you could have new service models. So from a micro standpoint, we would say, yes, indeed, innovation does drive a modern economy, but not necessarily in the ways you would traditionally see in newspaper headlines.
So I'm surprised that you say that, because from your paper, the paper that I read rather, I expected you to say biological sciences, because you use quite a lot of language coming from evolution. So yeah, how did that come about? How do you think that you've moved into this more biological framing?
So as you know, in the traditions of institutional economics, of which there are many, there has always been this sort of love-hate relationship between biology and economics, and that goes back a good 100 years at least. And it's precisely because we want to understand how certain kinds of population groups change over time. These population groups in my work are mostly firms or new technologies and so on. And we really want to understand both from a kind of a statistical process, but also in terms of the institutions and how they change in a society. We want to understand this much more. So perhaps it's not surprising that some of the language loosely connects, but a word of caution on this. You know, for those among your audiences who really want to dive into this, everyone from, you know, Veblen to others who have influenced certain areas of institutional economics in different ways have, of course, played with the notion of evolution. And I sit on the International Advisory Board for the Review of Evolutionary Political Economy, which started quite recently. And what we have is a very vast array of people working at different scales, different units of analysis, and different methodologies to really parse what is evolving over time, and what does this evolution really represent to a dynamic economy. So I think that's actually a fruitful conversation between the different disciplines. But to be honest, economics has been having that conversation with multiple disciplines, whether or not we recognize that over time, right? So it's exciting stuff, and we can be, depending on subgroups and your audiences, obviously they can go searching. There's a whole host of different groups that look into this much, much more, and with a fair amount of precision.
And Smita, last year you co-authored a paper called Emergency-Driven Capacity Building, COVID-19 and the UK's Response Towards Increasing Critical Testing Capability and Production of PPE. Now, when a member of the public looks at that, you know, we think that process was laden with issues and difficulties. So could you tell us a little bit more about that paper and what it said about the UK's ability to deal with emergencies and crisis? And I'm thinking about that, and when I read the paper, thinking about the climate crisis. What does that tell us with that perspective as well?
It's a good question, precisely because we're all thinking about this issue, right? How do we think about the health crisis, the climate crisis, energy, and so on? I began the paper actually from a different vantage point. So just to return to the theme that we began with in this discussion, why micro? Because we really want to try and understand why countries did so differently with respect to COVID in terms of their response. Why is it that some of the standard preoccupations of industrial development, GDP per capita, sophistication of technologies, resilience of health systems didn't quite go the way anybody expected around the globe? And I think without micro and particularly institutional and evolutionary perspectives, you would still be quite lost about how to explain this purely from a macro standpoint. Because the systems of institutional, sort of the norms, the rules, the guidelines, the standards, the technical standards, and the regulations with which countries, under very tight circumstances, with a huge amount of uncertainty, had to predict, or at least had to make good guesses about what to do, that really actually showed us how different the standard comparisons between countries could be imagined during this time. And so a country like sort of the UK versus a Brazil versus the US, France, India, you name it. These were countries that all responded in different ways, even though ostensibly they were all pushing towards the same goal, which is more vaccines or more COVID diagnostic kits or lockdowns and so on. So we began this research really to think about what the comparative national question was. Could we even reliably look at some of the indicators coming out to try and understand whether or not these were solid, instead of proclaiming that one country was doing worse or one country was doing better? So with that background, this paper with my UK colleagues was really to try and understand how did the regional, particularly the regional and the sort of subnational governments, manage the response in terms of allowing quite a lot of new rules to be written. In a way, the sort of agility to respond and not have everything go back through national governments becomes very important because health is such a local issue. And so pulling in new actors into the innovation mix, trying to identify new groups, but also strategically importing when you need it to, becomes a very critical issue. Now that's a sensitive question. We all know this has been highly sensitive across countries. And with a trade, effectively a trade embargo with everything from lockdown to actual cessation of exports, many countries didn't have the luxury of importing what they needed when they needed it. So there was immense pressure with the existing firms, the existing government labs, and so on, to actually respond. So we have been, I would say, fairly diplomatic in that working paper, and we are trying to think through how to be perhaps a little less diplomatic as we write the main paper. Right, so we know that there is a crisis, that there has been a crisis brewing in economics now for a good decade. Students responding saying we're not prepared to deal with practical issues. Professors feeling under siege about what they're teaching and feeling out of date. And this is the question on evidence. What do we consider to be legitimate evidence that we bring into not just the classroom, but open conversations about really quite critical policy decisions? Just as a slightly a response on how groups to come together to actually have this debate, I think it's really the moment for us in terms of several social crises to think about how we communicate with each other around our disciplines. After all, many of us are multidisciplinary, but we're also speaking across disciplines that are usually not in the same room at the same time. So the question of evidence becomes especially critical to be able to say, what am I actually looking at? So one thing that I think a lot of microeconomists or people interested in micro level issues for policy and planning, the thing that they do is they look at very practical measures. They look at measures such as how much money went into the system, how many, what types of subsidies were provided, how many of those firms performed, what kinds of quality of measures of diagnostic kits do we have? After a pandemic, will we have a new market for these things, right? So these are very practical questions that can only really be determined if you're keeping an open mind and coming to the table saying, I have a problem I want to solve. This is not going to be, I'll use that phrase again, an ideological conversation about who should be involved, because we will discover that there are many new stakeholders in order to solve the problem than were necessarily invited. This is usually the case. So if you have a biologist or if you have an economist or a policy planner, you have somebody else, they have to be able to say, I have data points 1, 2, 3, they're imprecise, they're not longitudinal, clean little panel sets that you can use over 7 years. I have this, it's messy, what can we do with it? So in a way, I think microeconomists, in the way I'm using that term, tend to be quite pragmatic. We need to see change happen, or you are seeing change happen and you want to figure out what did you learn from the situation that you can move. This is really important. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. You need people at the table who are willing to just say, all right, you have virology data. How might I connect this virology data to data with, say, lockdowns or with school closings or with the number of people queuing up at centers? So you must have a conversation that is really focused on what's out there. And because that generates our new theory as well, right? So I think this is a very exciting conversation.
it's wonderful to hear this from an economist, because maybe it's more the microeconomists and the macroeconomists who tend to have that approach. We often speak about William Nordhaus and his view of the climate, which was completely detached from any kind of climate science. And it was that kind of arrogance and that ego, is almost to say, well, no, your science has to fit into my model for it to be validated. And it's really refreshing to hear that, because that's much more practical when an economist sits in the room and says, I don't have all the answers. I've got some of them, but we all need to work together to find out what the answer is, and not that here's my paper on how the economy works and how we avoid climate crisis. So it's really refreshing to hear that.
Well, with just a response on the climate models, I think that relationship goes two ways. And in a way, because I think I came out of the sciences, I would have made a very mediocre scientist. But coming out of science, one of the things I was very aware of in a way, the pretensions of our different disciplines that propose either a hierarchy or refuse to speak to each other. So in a way, I think of my professional responsibility as also being a good interlocutor. We must do this, otherwise why the heck are we doing what we do? On the Nordhaus models, however, I would say that there is a kind of a major gap we have to be wary of or conscious of, which is that climate scientists also have really dropped the ball. They make very strong assumptions about how firms behave without a lot of evidence for it. So let's take a very practical example where I've taught students this, where we're looking at team building work around, say, flooding in Lower Manhattan or something like this. Now, if you say, I'm going to let it be somebody else's problem to figure out how to evacuate people in Lower Manhattan when the water rises, we are going to be moving all of our disciplines many years back. And the worry is that neither the climate scientists, who are still also talking in generalities about models and none of the practicalities, and certainly the economists, who are speaking about big frameworks without any of the practicalities, we're still not moving forward. So I am a little, I would say, cautious about where the fault lies. But one thing I would certainly stress is, for students coming into the field today, the bar is higher. You cannot just do an economics degree and hold it as a badge of honor unless you've really worked on practical problems. I, for example, in some of my areas, do not hire and do not recommend people who can't show that they've worked on practical problems, because I know, therefore, that their critical lens on theory and methods is really quite flawed. So it's important.
It's fantastic. I'm really heartened to hear you say that you're bringing economics into reality. Can you expand on the idea of a new economic nationalism taking shape globally?
So to respond to your earlier point briefly, because it will provide a good segue, I think. About 40 years ago, actually much more, Dick Nelson and Sidney Winter wrote their magnum opus on an evolutionary approach to economic growth. And a fundamental idea in that was really the role of new knowledge. And one of the things that's quite extraordinary is, even after probably now a good half century, economists who claim to be discussing new knowledge, new technologies, innovation, hardly reference this work at all. So there's a kind of dishonesty in economics that hasn't gone away, which is the pretension, many famous people writing about technology today who haven't read some of this path-breaking work or even decided to critique it in a useful way. So this applies to, I would say, a lot of folks working on economic development. I didn't get my PhD in an economics department, which is probably why I work on economics with all of my economics training in a much more applied way, because most of the economists I worked with were not only applied, they saw their academic role, their advisory role, their work with multilateral organizations, with firms, as a fairly seamless relationship of insights, theory, practice, teaching. And I think this comes back to the point you made, Karen, about the sort of responsibility of what universities have to take on. I fear a lot of universities are quite happy with the status quo, and so are a lot of professors. On the economic nationalism, I think going forward, those countries that recognize their particular bundle of institutions and organizations do not look at them with rose-tinted glasses, but are able to view what they have with a kind of a sense of realism, understand what technologies, technological capabilities they have, what science or what research or what types of firms they have, are going to move forward very quickly. We've already seen, partly because of COVID, but in the last 3 years, 3 to 5 years, if you looked at the top 5 economies by just GDP, not GDP per capita, but GDP and the investments coming in, you will see that there are very few countries in the top 10 list that you could predictably say would continue to be there. In fact, in the next 10 years, you will see an entirely different set of countries making up the top 5 or the top 7. Now, you could poo-poo this idea and say, who cares about GDP or who cares about the growth numbers? But growth is important for the simple reason that it is showing us that some places are agile enough to combine and recombine their rules, the types of organizations, and the nature of investment. For small countries, I think this is going to be quite difficult, but therefore their relationships and bilateral partnerships with other countries, their ability to do diplomacy in new ways, are also going to be very important for not just bringing the investment in, but expanding the market. So to come back to your point, William, I think even for that, there has to be a much greater decentralization as well as autonomy about defining the region and the kinds of industrial or innovation policies they have authority over.
And that's a really interesting perspective. And when we think of small, we think of agile. You know, and you said that's a real determinant is being agile, but also there's other elements that lead to success when you're a nation. You have to have a big enough population. You have to have a wide enough sphere of influence, as you were saying there. But I think if we were to look at kind of some smaller nations like Finland, Denmark, and New Zealand, they're kind of the 3 nations that Scotland, in a sense, kind of aspires to. Are their institutions different from larger units, like a Canada or a United States?
It's a great question. I mean, one little piece I would add to this debate is the structure of the economy, the composition of the economy matters. If you are particularly from an industrial policy standpoint, economic development standpoint, you must have some diversification for the very simple the context that if you don't, not only are you highly dependent on your neighbors or your region, you are from an innovation standpoint, at considerable risk. Let's for a moment step over to West Asia, right, or the Persian Gulf region. There's a reason there is so much worry and foment. And it is because the diversification out of their source industries is neither fast enough, nor are there sufficient numbers of groups that are willing to invest, stay for the long haul. You have to think about migration. You have to think of a lot of things. So I would actually encourage regions that are thinking about a long-term autonomy or a long-term future to really try to get back to the design table and ask, are those the right countries to contrast with? Might there be, given the structure of the economy, a different set of places, either nations or other sub-regional entities that could be better comparisons and much tighter relationships built with them? I would not say that New Zealand or Scotland, for example, should be compared for a range of reasons having to do with the structure of the economy. But I might say that a more useful comparison, let's just say you want to build out, let's go back to the COVID paper for a second. You actually want to build out a lot of your labs, and you want to restructure the labs and the health system in a new way that perhaps looks at ports and logistics or warehousing. I might even look at very different economies like Oman, which have really don't come in the same frame that we are traditionally taught. But these are countries that are also trying to figure out how to move things forward. They're combining things that are unexpected. And so if European conversations or continental or UK conversations stay within either the landmass or across the pond, you run the risk of not looking at really exciting comparisons. And I think we do need to go back to the drawing board for those, because I'm a great believer in policy menus that not only build partnerships around the world, but also allow you to have a set of options that brings people to the table for a discussion. And it's an exciting time. It's really an exciting time, not just geopolitically, but you know, it's a high risk moment, and you're all closer to big changes in Europe. But this is true in Asia and Africa as well. So instead of discussing them purely as nations or as continents, but if we look both at national and sub-regional level, and also across industries, specific industries, you open out a set of policy menu options that is far more interesting to build models out.
I think on a grander scale, right now, every country on the planet has this opportunity because of the decarbonisation of the economy, moving towards a just transition, and also, you know, fighting the climate crisis. The institutions are a position where they were in the, you know, the outbreak of the Second World War, when firms have to completely change, the government has to change, society has to change the way that we do everything. Do you think that's a fair way to look at the economy now and what it needs to change?
I think we find ourselves in a very odd moment. We are really at a stage where the number of countries pushing back against the traditional Bretton Woods sort of institutional framework, it's a very large number. And this is true especially outside Europe, but even within kind of the wider UK and surely Scotland, as well as the European debates. The Bretton Woods institutions have got us to a particular moment where we can only go so far. And while we may use them in quite a clunky way to make them work, the reality is that we require very different rules and stewardship that are really missing in the debate today. So one of the reasons I think a kind of a micro focus actually approaches geopolitics in a new way is because there's a kind of agnosticism about different subsectors. For instance, at the WTO, you might take one position around agriculture, but a very different position around extractive industries. And there isn't one national position on all of these subsectors. And this is really important. This is part of the agility that you want to have, not be pegged as this country is always going to do X or Y. And I think the ability to rewrite those rules occurs at different levels. One, of course, is the kind of multilateral, the supranational level. But there are many others, and they could be within conventions and frameworks. They could be within particular joint venture partnerships that are built across multiple industries. So I think we need to be conscious that the customs, the norms, the rules, the guidelines, the technical standards are as important, if not more, in keeping that agility alive. Not all our tweaking has to happen at the level of the United Nations or some European convention. It can happen at other levels. And leaving those options on the table seems especially important. I don't know, I speak from a point of great ignorance about the issues that are being discussed on your side, but I do know that anytime you want to have a deepening of industrial capabilities or building out a long-term plan for sort of a technologically capable region, you must have the authority as well as new stakeholders to set those priorities in the first place. You can't be given priorities. You have to have forums for discussing what those might be. And you know, not everyone likes debate. We know that. Debate means change. Change is uncomfortable.
So when economies change, Smita, for example, when a country becomes independent, how much of an impact do you think that has on institutions? Do they change? And if so, does that tend to happen quickly, slowly? And I would imagine that economic change is in part a reaction against prevailing institutions.
You know from the history of economic development, even over the last 75 to 80 years, that the countries that became newly independent went through really a lot of trauma on decolonization. And without kind of going down the road of asking what forms of trauma that might have taken, it is evident that the pace of institutional change was much slower than the optimism that prevailed at the time. It was certainly the case that there was a lot of power, different groups that wished to retain power remained, and it's not that easy to dislodge these groups. So I think the history of economic development, on the one hand, is quite a pessimistic story, because it means that the geopolitical relations through which continued investment and dependence built into the structure of countries and country controls, that's a depressing story. That's not a very optimistic story. On the other hand, from a technology and an industrial development story, I would say I'm hugely optimistic. I actually think the more attention you pay to the fundamentals of the economy, as opposed to the big letter marquee, sort of here's what our economy is about. You start looking at fundamentals and you give room in the institutional transition for different groups to not just discuss. I don't mean to keep this abstract. I also mean very practically, somebody's got to invest. Somebody's got to expand their firms. Someone's got to build out new joint ventures or new technology licensing partnerships. These actually allow for a much more realistic conversation about new actors in the process. And you give up some autonomy because you become embedded within a global economy in a new way. But that's not necessarily a bad problem to have. It depends what the goal is here. So I would say that the process of some types of institutional change are slow, but some are incredibly rapid. An example, we have learned in a very short 2-year period with high uncertainty that people's minds can be changed for good or bad about a lot of things. We have seen that people will queue for staples in a way that we didn't think was going to happen. We have seen people respond to vaccinations or not respond well to vaccinations, but yet countries have managed and move ahead. If you had to put that in the long run perspective, every crisis of this kind shows us that a new set of assumptions have to be brought in and updated in our models. People are willing to do surprisingly new things, depending on how the wider environment is seen. So Schumpeter, the Austrian economists, many of them recognized this, the original American institutionalists recognized how critical uncertainty was in framing the debate on economics. So if you have any audience out here today in your taping who's reluctant to pick up some new economist, I strongly urge, especially young people in economics, ask yourself, why am I not being taught X or Y? Go hunt down some of the big ferocious debates in institutionalism over the last 100 years. What kinds of debates were out there, and might they be relevant again when we think about risk, uncertainty, evolution? These are really critical issues, because almost any complex social problem is going to have people distributed over some spectrum that we want to try and understand. Having said that, in any changing economy, there are going to be transitions that are not going to be popular. And anticipating that that is not going to be popular is as much part of the plan as anything else. So having the ability to not just buffer hardship, but also being fairly hard-nosed about communicating priorities is non-trivial. People don't want to take on the political task of being unpopular. So in the realm of communicating what are higher or lower priorities, you know, hats off to people in the political arena, because they are the ones who actually bear the highest risk and probably the most honest assessment of whether or not they've been effective. Academics are probably the slowest in this transformation. I'm a bit of a cynic at the pace at which universities and academia transforms. So I would almost urge that one should be somewhat cautious about all the economic models people are seeing. The ones who probably have the highest stakes are the ones coming in who are putting out their model and saying, test this, or try this, or I think this might work, let's have a conversation, or have you considered X or Y, and let's see how it plays out. Those are the folks you want to trust more, because they've thrown their hat in the ring and said, let's try. They have not said, here is what it looks like on the blackboard and in paper X in journal Y, right? They're actually saying, let's have a conversation about what we might try. Now, it's politically unpopular to do that, but it's actually where I think the future of economics lies. We have to have a much more open-ended conversation about almost a type of experimentation that has to take place, and an acknowledgement that nobody is going to get this right at all times. So to come back to your question, the communication about what that adjustment might look like and which new types of organizations might be needed is a critical part of this story of institutional variety. I don't think we can theorize it in the abstract. We really have to look at what is there and what is likely to come. So every country or every region is quite different. So if there's one thing to take away from kind of the perspective of institutional variety, it's really that you should recognize that your economy is not going to look like any other, exactly. And starting from that pragmatism, then one can start looking for proximate comparisons or good adjustment mechanisms. I don't think there's any other way. So you could say it's not really science. You're right, but economics wasn't ever really science.
Well, a wonderful way to finish. Smita, thanks so much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS. It's been fascinating. And Karen, we need to get more microeconomists on the show. That's for absolute certainty after that discussion. It was absolutely fascinating. Smita, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks a ton. A real pleasure.
Thanks very much for your comments. I hope you enjoyed that. It was very different from our normal conversations on much more macro. So, interest rates, inflation, employment. I think those conversations are really important to be had, especially around the institutions we have in our economy. And I think that when we're looking at independence, we're concentrating too much on the kind of macroeconomics and not really thinking about how we can change the small elements within our economy. So our corporate governance, our tax system, how the markets work, regulation, and also the role of institutions. And I think that's really, really important. After the interview with Smita, I looked into one of our new institutions, which is the Scottish National Investment Bank, and I've written a blog post on SCOTONOMICS, which I'd encourage you to read, because I think that you'll find the type of investment that it's making is maybe very different from what you would expect from a national investment bank. So that's a little bit of a teaser. Head over to scotonomics.scot and check out the blog post on the Scottish National Investment Bank. So thanks very much for your comments. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting was with regard to the latest, or the first paper that the Scottish Government released last week. And Smita was quite clear in saying that it's not really a completely valuable process to look at other economies and say we can be a bit like them. We need to be much more micro in that sense and look abroad and say we really like this, we could copy that, or we could be similar to that. And I thought that was really interesting. Her approach is much more granular than what we come to expect from some of the Scottish Government papers. I'm not sure how else you can do it by comparing yourself to other nations which appear similar, but there's certainly another way to do that in terms of the granularity of it. So I thought that was really interesting from Smita as well. So thank you very much for joining us. As I said, we've got an extended interview with Smita on our Patreon, which I would love you to consider joining if you can afford, if you can spare £5 a month, that would be great. Next week, we have a really interesting interview with another popular and well-known person from the progressive left in England. That's Grace Berkeley. So I hope you can join us then. Until next week. Bye for now.